interview in the series that is all about empowering a league of extraordinary mothers on how to use the power of food to get more energy, a body we love, and that zest for life that we crave. Today's interview is with Belinda Fettke. Belinda and her husband Gary Fettke have become a powerhouse couple in their dedication to empowering people to take back control of their health. We had yesterday's interview in this series went out with Professor Noakes and his extraordinary journey through court cases and so on in order to be able to talk about a different dietary approach. And in Australia, we have only just, Belinda, I think we just worked out 3.5 weeks ago, had a similar story coming out in Australia, and with Belinda's husband, Gary, and it is a hugely exciting time because there is a whole new world of information now that is opening up. And so today I am so excited to have Belinda with us to share a bit of her journey and how she has come through this and became a spokesperson for her husband, who was silenced for 4.5 years. Was it, Belinda? Yeah.
He was investigated for 4.5 years,
okay.
And the official ruling was over 2 years that we've been trying to fight.
Yeah.
All about sugar to start with, and then it became about the low carb, healthy fats, which is Tim was speaking about as well. So there's been a real movement and an anti-movement to trying to silence these people, and I just couldn't work out why the science was being so hushed, and I just wanted to work out why. So yeah, I went researching.
Yeah. So in essence, he was silenced from talking about the effects of sugar and carbohydrates on diabetes and obesity. Was that the...
Yeah, I think we've got to start a little bit with Gary's story. He was on his own health journey.
Yep.
He was diagnosed with cancer in 2000. He had an aggressive pituitary tumour, and he did all the things he was supposed to do, and we're never advocating that you don't go down that normal path either. But he had surgery, he had a craniotomy, he had stereotactic radiotherapy, and he went on to chemotherapy. And he had another surgery in 2004. He was on chemotherapy on and off for all of that time. And then in 2009, when the tumour was becoming very active and they couldn't control it with chemo anymore, he just didn't feel like he could have another surgery. It's hugely invasive, a craniotomy. And so he just was clutching at straws and looking for other things, and happened to be told by our pharmacist about a drug called metformin, which they were using for people with type 2 diabetes. They were doing some studies into it and found that people who were on the metformin, I mean, this is my basic understanding of it, were having less incidence of cancer, or that their cancer was going into remission. And so our pharmacist suggested that maybe Gary might like to add metformin to his 13 or 15 medications that he was taking per day. And he decided to have a little bit of a look in to see what metformin did. And in essence, it stops the uptake of sugar, well, puts it into a different place, but takes it out of the blood glucose, the bloodstream. And he thought, why would I take another medication when maybe I could just stop eating sugar? So then he found out David Gillespie's book, Sweet Poison. And so he went down that pathway, and it took a good few months because suddenly we had no sugar in the house and things, and we're allowed to have dextrose and we're allowed to have carbs and everything else. And then he went, wait a minute, carbohydrates turn into glucose the minute you ingest them. So it's been a learning process. It's amazing what you learn in biochemistry in medicine and nursing, and as a health practitioner yourself. You learn it, and then you're so taught about band-aiding medicine that you completely forget all that basic biochemistry.
Yeah.
And it took that bit of time, and Gary found with his tumour, which doesn't metastasize, and as I say, it was an aggressive pituitary tumour, but there was no risk of metastases. So he found that he was able to control his cancer for the first time in 11.5 years. And he stayed on the chemo and was using nutritional ketosis as an adjunct, which is, I would say he would keep his carbohydrate intake under 50 and mostly probably under 20 or 30.
Yeah.
But it's not no carbs, and it's not that he never has a bit of pumpkin or sweet potato or a few berries. He just doesn't eat a lot because he knows if he stays in this place, his cancer's under control. So he doesn't want to eat it because of the risk of having to go back onto chemo or risk of more surgery. So he's been off chemo for 5 years now, and he was never able to do that, eating an incredibly high sugar and carbohydrate diet. Because part of his pituitary tumour also meant that he had a little bit of diabetes insipidus. So he had to drink a lot, and he was told, have juice. It's a good way to get lots of drink, lots of fluid in. So he was, I swear, a really high sugar carb person. He was eating all his whole grain toasts. He was eating his cereals. He was eating pasta and rice and just everything that he thought was good and healthy, lots of fruit. But when you look back now, it was massively high carbohydrate diet.
Just to give people a little bit of background that may not have heard about you and Gary before. Gary, you were a registered nurse in a past life, and Gary is a
orthopedic surgeon.
Orthopedic surgeon.
Yes, and so in his practice, he sees people with inflammation, weight-related joint issues. He sees people with complications of type 2, or all diabetes, but a lot of type 2 diabetes coming through. And 20 years ago, he might have to amputate a lower leg, maybe once, twice a year at the most. And in the last few years, with the tsunami of type 2 diabetes coming up, he was finding he was amputating, because with type 2 diabetes, peripheral neuropathy causes rotting ulcers and flesh on the feet. And so he was amputating bits of feet, toes, forefeet, heels, whole feet, and even lower limbs. And it was becoming once a week, if not twice a week. And that's a huge difference. And he said it happened very quickly. And, over about 5 years, it just suddenly went up. Yeah. So when he worked out about the sugar in his diet and improving his cancer, he thought about it for diabetes. He was pre-diabetic. And because of this metformin thing, he thought, well, let's see. And so he was recommending to his patients that they reduce sugar. And when he was in the hospital, in the workplace, he realized that his patients that were coming in for surgery were under the hospital food and the hospital menu and the guidelines for diabetes. It's 3 desserts a day. So not only carbohydrate loading, but these desserts. And so the people were coming in and their blood glucose were out of control, and they weren't healing and they weren't getting better. And so he started to question and say, I'm seeing some really good things with myself and in my practice with reducing sugar. He tried to talk to dietitians at the hospital, and he tried to talk to the hospital food and just different people, just saying, I'm really seeing results, and can we think about what we're serving patients? And that the dietitians weren't nearly as excited as he was. And there was a lot of conversation going backwards and forwards, I think, between the Dietitians Association of Australia and these dietitians at the hospital. And I'm not blaming them specifically, because that's what they were taught, that sugar was okay. And they've been given these guidelines to work by. But the Dietitians Association of Australia, the CEO, wrote to the hospital in 2013 and 2014, just like Tim Noakes, and they said, silence this man. And we only got access to those documents in November last year. We had no idea about that pressure. And I've been trying to work out why Gary was silenced for all this time. And so, 4 years into it, we finally found these documents, and then since we've found even more. So it's about the Dietitians Association of Australia have been paid to influence, protect, and actively defend the cereals, grains, and sugar messaging. And they've used their members to do that. And their members have not necessarily known that that's what has been going on behind the scenes. So I think for them as well, and for doctors who've been told to medicate and band-aid sick care, for them as well, it's going to be a really hard thing to start to admit that potentially they've been prescribing harm. And certainly, how do they feel with themselves and not knowing how to care, like Gary all those years ago? And he actually wrote a blog in 2014 telling everyone he was sorry. He just said, I had no idea. I hadn't realised I'd been educated to forget the basics, and I'm sorry that this has happened, and I want to make amends. I want to make up for it. So, he was specifically talking about sugar to start with, and then it became understanding how much sugar was in processed food and the carbohydrates in processed food. And food can be medicine, and I think naturopaths and health advocates. So many other people have known and been aware of this, yet the doctors under the medical system and dietitians have been educated by the food and pharmaceutical industry for a very long time.
Yeah. It is a source of enormous confusion for all of us, because anybody from our generation, and even, you know, my children have grown up with the food pyramid or something, you know, that's now the food plate or whatever it is. And having any kind of concept that, you know, I mean, all the conversations that go on in mainstream media, there has been so much vilifying of the wackos that talk about something outside of that. And it's a very powerful body that have undermined a different message. So I cannot thank you enough for staying in this fight, because I can't even imagine the toll it's taken on your family to have been through this journey, but the rest of us are so grateful to you.
Well, yeah, since Gary's had been exonerated, now the Dietitians Association, only 4 days later, severed all ties with the food industry, which will be a massive move forward, I think, for dietetics, and also hopefully a flow-on effect into medicine and to the dietary guidelines. Gary's hoping to get involved, certainly, as he said, 7 years ago he wanted to talk about the hospital food. So now he's been exonerated, and they've said they're not going to go after anyone who's talking, well, not going after Gary again for any discussion on low carb. So I presume that means everybody. So yeah, the opportunity now to get into the dietary guidelines, I think the dietary guidelines, and even if you hear it from the Dietitians Association of Australia, it was a guideline for healthy people. And yet it's been adopted for sick. It's been adopted for schools. It's been adopted for hospitals. It's been adopted for the military. It didn't really become flexible. It was stated. And Gary did a talk at the CrossFit Games last year, and he put up the plate or the circle of the dietary guidelines, eating for health, and he circled every single bit of processed food on that guideline. And honestly, it looked like it was shotgunned. And he said, you have to send out a search and rescue party to find the red meat and the dairy on this guideline. What's happened to real food?
Yeah.
You know, it's quite amazing how it's just the fear of fat. And that came around in the 1970s and had been building for a long time, but certainly 1977, the McGovern report. But it was pushed by vested interests. It was pushed by ideology, and this fear of fat brought on our low fat, which meant lots and lots of sugar and all sorts of other things. But people have feared this thing. And the important thing to realize is with cholesterol, it's not fat that sits and becomes a plaque in your body. Because if you think, even though fat might sit in your drain and in your pan and it solidifies, and that was the fear, fat solidified, where oils don't. They stay at room temperature, they stay oily. But our bodies are 37 degrees. And fat doesn't solidify at 37 degrees. That's when it's still runny. So the plaques of cholesterol have actually been formed from sugar and carbohydrates. And Gary has, on my website, I've put up a picture of his lipid subfraction profile, which is a specific test you can have done for cholesterol. And it shows that there's no bad LDLs at all. And he has been low carb, high healthy fat, like Tim Noakes, for 5 years. And there's no sign of any heart issues. So I think we need to start getting past this fear of fat. And I think there's a little bit of it. Like even the dietitians are starting to talk about a healthy fat, but they only call it healthy fat if it's nuts or olive oil. But, you know, there really is an opportunity for these healthy fats to be healthy saturated animal fats as well. And making that move to a lower carb, lower processed diet, and more into real food, especially meats and dairy and above ground veggies, but below ground veggies. And nothing's really taboo if you take it more from an unprocessed point of view.
Yeah. It's amazing how we seem to follow one very, you know, we become fanatical about one style of eating and then another and another. And we've sort of done a big swing to paleo not that long ago. And there were doctors like Dr. Terry Walls, who I'm thinking of, who's turned around her MS and done extraordinary things with it. But now we're doing a big swing back to vegan and vegetarianism, and I see this very strongly in, with my girls in high school, and a lot of their friends are all now vegan as well. What's caused this big swing back again to the vegan and vegetarian? Because we did do it, back in the 80s. We sort of have done these swings, and now this is where we are now. Well, how do you think this has happened?
It's very interesting. I think we need to look at the guidelines, age, activity, metabolic health, and start to look at what we're eating. As Gary said, our mitochondria, which are the engine centers of our cells, they don't care where the food comes from. They don't care if it comes from plantation, a rubbish tip, vegan, vegetarian, low carb, paleo, carnivore. If you're a lion, then your mitochondria doesn't care. It just wants fuel.
Yes.
And it's people that have made it so emotional. It's people that are wanting to do a particular thing or another particular thing. I think being responsible for our planet's really, really important, but I don't believe vegan and vegetarianism are necessarily any better than regenerative farming and looking at the land, because even though people think that cows are causing all this methane, a lot of those studies have come from vested interests and ideology, and we need to be looking at, if we take the cows off our soil, off our land, and then where's all the fertilizer going to come from? Where's the natural fertilizer? Like, animals actually protect our land and regenerate and do amazing things for our soil. If we go down the vegan pathway, we have to have these massive monocultures. The bees get shipped from one spot to the next spot, and so many of them die getting to one spot, and they don't like canola flour. A lot of them die, and they get very aggressive in canola fields. It's looking back at nature. How do we make it sustainable? Gary always wanted to do permaculture from the time I met him, when we were nearly 40 years ago. We were really keen to have a permaculture farm, to know that the bugs and the things were working together. And I think people get very caught up with this vegan thing about animals, and there's no doubt that some of the way that some of the animals are raised, especially in those contained areas, are bad. But in Tasmania, we're so lucky. Our chickens are free range. They're running around our acres of land here and giving us eggs. And I think we did a big shift into cities in the early 1900s. And that big shift opened up opportunities not just to processed food industry, especially cereal industry, but it also meant that we weren't thinking about where our food came from. And so my argument would be to people who are just choosing to do vegan because they think it's the right thing, is to really think about our land and where it's come from. And there's a lot of interesting discussion around that whole point of view, but a lot of people get sick as vegans. And Nina Teicholz, who's wrote The Big Fat Surprise, she's a journalist in America. She was one of Tim Noakes's Charlie's Angels. Marika Sporas, who's written a lot of Tim Noakes's Trial and done all of that work, and Zoe Harcum as well, who's done a PhD into the dietary guidelines. All three of them were vegan, and they got sick. And so they went, wait a minute, we're doing what's meant to be the most healthy thing for our bodies. We're vegan. And they learned that it wasn't good for their body. I think for some people, especially if you've got metabolic disease, you can't process that high carbohydrate, it's not a good way to go. And a lot of people who are vegan, unless they're really watching their diet, their teeth get quite bad as well, which is a sign of ill health. But if you watch, we've got sheep out in our paddock, they graze all day. If you are a vegan or a vegetarian, you are constantly hungry because the food doesn't last for very long. It's like putting twigs on a fire. Whereas if you eat healthier fats, if you eat good protein, good source of protein, you can have much longer breaks between eating, so your body can reset and have, start, stop. And There's a lot of talk around fasting. I haven't done a lot of the big, long intermittent fasting, but I fast every night.
Yeah.
Breakfast is breaking the fast. And so, when you take that to where you eat and what you eat, I think you don't get nearly as hungry if you're eating a low carbohydrate, healthy fat diet compared to being a vegan or vegetarian. You tend to snack a lot, and so you've got food in your mouth a lot.
Yeah, I know. I was vegetarian for 20 years and I've lost track of the number of health professionals that I talk to and know who have all this exactly the same story, vegan or vegetarian for many, many years, but just struggled to thrive despite all the knowledge that we have. And, some people do seem to be able to do it really well, but I certainly didn't. And I had 4 pregnancies and 6 years of breastfeeding and got sicker and sicker and could never manage my weight. And the quantities of food that I ate compared to what I eat now, I can't even think about.
That's the other thing to talk about. People say, oh, vegan and vegetarian is so much better for the planet. But if you're eating so much more than you would eat if you weren't, it's also an interesting concept of, maybe we're a bit skewed. And again, I think the processed food industry want us to be vegan and vegetarian because they can make all our food.
Yeah.
Like they can make all the meat analogs, they can make everything. So
yeah, well, it's certainly the need to rely on carbohydrates, I found was huge. So
yes.
Okay, well, look, there's so many ways that I want to go with this conversation, and I'm just wondering how to serve our audience best with the time that we've got. With the DAA breaking ties with the food industry, how is this going to look? Are we going to, perhaps for, the role of these conversations is so that we're not waiting for all the information to come via mainstream media.
It's going to take a long time still. It's going to take a long time. There's a lot, the researchers, so many of them have got vested interests or ties to food and sugar industries. So I think the exciting thing about breaking those ties, and it is the first in the world to acknowledge or to do that severing, I think it's going to hopefully mean that the dietary guidelines can be looked into now and revised. But I would love to see people have an opportunity. Well, I would love to see healthcare professionals and allied health practitioners have a toolkit to be able to support people with vegan, vegetarian, omnivore, even carnivore. Some people, and when I say carnivore, it's not just meat, it's meat and dairy, but some people find if they've got really, really bad guts, everyone says whole grain is best for bowel and all those other things. But if you've got a terribly irritated bowel, they're finding in the children's hospital in one of the United States, one of the big children's hospitals over there, they've gone 0 carb. And these kids are thriving, whereas they just could not get control of their irritable bowel. And they were having, big chunks of their bowel removed because they couldn't cope with it. So Crohn, really nasty Crohn's and things. And so I'm hoping that now the dietary guidelines are severing these ties and the guidelines are going to be revisited, that it will give an opportunity for people to work out what's best for their health.
Yeah.
And again, going back to that mitochondria, our mitochondria don't care where the fuel comes from. So maybe we need to start to be less emotional about eating and think of it more as fuel, as something like we put in our car. We put petrol in our car to get from A to B. And yes, sometimes you go, gee, I'd really love to go down there because it's going to be cheaper, or I'd really love to go there because they're more ethical.
Yeah.
But, we need fuel in our car. And maybe it's about making emotional ties and connections in a whole lot of other ways. And it's not about food. And I think that our culture is driven by celebrating around food. And that's also going to be really, really tricky to move beyond. But grandson's about to have his first birthday, and my daughter was saying the other day, well, you know what, Thomas doesn't really eat sweet things and anything like that. So she said, I'm thinking of making a frittata cake and covering it with Philadelphia cream cheese and decorating it, and cutting out little dinosaurs and things like that. No, he doesn't know what a chocolate cake is. So again, it's just changing it up. So she'll serve this cake that looks like a cake and then cut into it and it's frittata inside. So it's still celebrating, but it's how do you do things a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And I think with our kids, if we can reduce the processed food, but make it normal, not make them stand out like they're different to anyone else. But we feed them lower carb at home. You know, this is just normal. We don't have big buckets of rice with our dinner at night or big bowls of pasta. We make zucchini noodles. We make fun things.
Yeah.
And then if our kids are metabolically healthy, it does not matter for them to have a sandwich at lunch. Like at school, they can go to school and feel like everybody else. And it's really easy to make a sandwich and put a piece of fruit in and, you know, make something, cheeses and yogurts and other things with their lunch as well. But I think you can easily make a child's food intake low carb over the day. Yeah. Because it's not about, I think some people have gotten so worried and so scared, but most children are born metabolically healthy. So how do we keep them metabolically healthy? We keep their carbohydrates down enough that we keep them really healthy and fuel them on healthy fats and proteins. And I think Tim definitely would talk about that sort of thing with kids too.
Yeah, he does. And so, well, look, to give, you know, we're talking about changing the food guidelines that we've all grown up with. Perhaps if we can put that into a little bit more of a practical picture for what you and Gary are talking about, what would those food guidelines look in your house with, you know, look, actually breaking it down to perhaps putting a plate together, or how do you best describe that?
Well, we tend to break fast. Gary breaks fast at 7 o'clock in the morning because he's got a huge day ahead of him and he tends to have just a snack for lunch. Megan and I, we have our breakfast later in the day, and so it's more of a brunch or even a lunch sometimes. But we tend to try and have eggs then, and sometimes it's egg cream, bit of frittata, a scrambled egg. It can just be a boiled egg on the go. It can be eggs and greens, or it can be leftover from the night before. I can make up, we've got a fantastic butcher who sources his meats locally, pasture-fed animals, and he does all of his own bacon without the nitrites and nitrates and all the bad things supposedly that are in things. He makes beautiful bacon, so occasionally we'll have some bacon and eggs, or we'll have bacon and greens, or we'll just make roast tomatoes, and I don't know, there's a whole lot of things, but we don't have cereal for breakfast. Our grandson, our daughter's making him a ground nut. He's not allergic to nuts, so he's having an almond meal, cheese seed, coconut, a cereal that she makes herself, and he loves it. Like, that's what he's used to, so he just thinks it's the same as a wheat mix. Then again, so for lunch, I say me and I probably would have that as our one meal, and then we'd have dinner. I make seed and nut crackers. From my daughter created a recipe around it, and they're just beautiful, crisp little crackers. It might have a piece of cheese on if you're hungry as a snack. Certainly cucumber, carrot sticks, all sorts of bits along the raw veggie line, and a little bit of fruit. Again, depending on metabolic health, if you've got cancer or you've got type 2 diabetes, you probably cut back on the fruit. But if you're healthy, a piece of fruit a day is, I would think, perfectly fine for someone who's metabolically healthy. It's just being aware that sometimes if you eat a lot of fruit or sweetness, that it can drive the hunger for more. So it depends also on what you're able to do. And then for dinner, we have meat and veg, like any sort. And where we would normally have had rice or pasta, I've got a great noodler. I can just make a big lot of zucchini noodles at once. I dry them out a little bit in a towel, and I can then put it into a Ziploc bag or some sort of container in the fridge, and it will last a week, and you can just keep pulling the handfuls out. And they're beautiful just with a quick light stir fry, and then put your bolognese toppings or whatever. I mean, it's beautiful with a carbonara. You can have anything with it. You can also use just steamed veggies. And I make cauliflower rice, and my kids love my cauliflower fried rice as much as they used to love the other fried rice because it's got the other bits in it.
Yeah.
that make it taste so yummy. So it's just more like having that texture.
Yeah.
And cauliflower mash, Tim Noakes' Real Meal Revolution. Oh my gosh, the shepherd's pie that they've got in that book. It's a beautiful meat base, and then it's just cauliflower mash blended with butter and egg yolks, and then you bake it with a bit of cheese on top. And you'd never know you weren't having mashed potatoes. So in my mind, it's just been an easy transition. I actually love cooking so much more now than I did when we were carb heavy, because we base our things on carbs before. We're having all the toppings and all the other bits. It's just so much nicer.
The conversation that just keeps going through my head is, how did we get to a place in the culture where eating like that is deemed something that should be silenced, or something that shouldn't be talked about, or is going to kill us and be bad for us? It just astounds me.
Gary and Tim Noakes' cases were going along pretty much at the same time. Tim's was very public and Gary's was all behind the scene. In Australia, the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency do a star chamber investigation. They never actually have any contact with the person, and from the start you are guilty until you prove your innocence. And we made the big mistake because we had no idea what to do in the beginning, because Gary's thinking, this is a joke. How can I be in trouble for talking about sugar?
Yeah.
And so he kept trying to give them so much information. He ended up supplying them with, I think, between 800 and 1,000 references from all over the place about the harms of sugar and carbohydrate and the plus of healthy fats. Yeah. And he actually printed out every one of these pages. He highlighted them all and he sent them. But the more you defend yourself, the more information then they have to question and attack. So when Gary was reported the second time, he was still trying to defend. By the third one, we just went, where's your case? So we've worked out, if anyone's a health professional watching this, and have to come after you, just go, yeah, and why? Because they build their case on you defending. And so if you don't give them anything, then they have to try and they've got to do all the work, which is, we worked out a bit late, but it's done us well. I think the reason, though, that Gary's case became so highlighted, or was able to, was because when he received the notification that that they wanted him to be quiet, he wasn't allowed to give out a handout to his patients anymore, just telling them how to reduce sugar. That's all his handout was. APRA said he wasn't allowed to do that. He wasn't allowed to speak on social media or to the public, and not to his patient, and it was questionable. They were investigating him. So he determined that during the investigation, he wouldn't stop talking to his patients. And we decided that, seeing it was just so crazy, and he had about 5,500 people following him on social media at the time, which really wasn't very big. He thought it was amazing. He was a doctor in Tasmania. And so we just crossed out his Facebook page, and instead of Gary Fettke No Fructose, it became Belinda Fettke No Fructose. And we did a big song and dance about it. Had 1 million views of that one post when we changed over, and realized that the power of the people questioning such ridiculous rulings, a bit like Tim, people just responding, going, how can this be happening? How can a doctor be in trouble for recommending real food? And so I have used the public as the jury to support, which has been incredible. And I can't thank people enough for supporting and sharing and questioning all of this when it was about real food. And the more I researched, because again, once Gary was being silenced, the only expert witness that was brought into Gary's case was an emeritus professor of Southeast Asia Pacific, and as St. Gary's, Launceston, like we're right at the bottom of the world, in a small town, 120,000 catchment area. And the expert witness worked for Sanitarium. And I had expected him to work for Coca-Cola or one of the sugar things, because I knew Coca-Cola is very much like tobacco industry, and they're doing a lot of spin doctoring about the sugar message. But when I found out it was Sanitarium and cereal industry, I was quite surprised. And so looking back, when the cereal industry first formed in, there were 101 cereal companies back in the early 1900s. And they are one of our staple diet. If you think everyone has cereal for breakfast, they've done an amazing job marketing. I came across some minutes from the Australian Breakfast Cereal Manufacturers Forum. In June, I came across 3 confidential documents, but they were on Google because I can assure you I can't hack. I don't know how to do anything like that. And these documents stated that they were sponsoring the Dietitians Association of Australia, or their corporate partnership was $23,000. And for that, they expected the Dietitians Association of Australia to influence, protect, and actively defend the cereal and grains messaging and sugar, because so many cereals have got sugar in them. And I looked at the people that were their influencers. They were expected to send so much information out to their members. They were running hashtags cereal for brekkie and all sorts of things. And I would say a lot of dietitians had no idea it was part of a commercial agreement with a breakfast cereal manufacturing group, which was Sanitarium, Kellogg's, Freedom Foods, and Nestle, which own Uncle Toby's Oats as well. And so the main cereal companies in Australia were using the Dietitians Association of Australia, the parent body, the actual association, as a vehicle. And when I found also with those documents, Gary's name and Marianne DeMasi, they were both targeted in that 2013-2014 time. These documents name them as targeted for active defence by the Dietitians Association of Australia. And so when you go, wow, if you have a look at all the anti-low carb messaging that's come out in the media, you will see they're the names of the people that were called influencers in these documents. And I think that's frightening. So I'm hoping with the Dietitians Association of Australia severing all ties with the food industry, because we're starting to question these documents, and we have sent them to a Senate inquiry and to journalists and different people. So a lot of other people are seeing these documents now. They end up being 49 in total. And I'm hoping that we'll also cut ties, because the Dietitians Association of Australia spokesperson program started in 1999 at the same time as the food industry started sponsoring the Dietitians Association of Australia. So that was sponsoring them. They were sponsoring the spokespeople to be their mouthpiece.
Yeah. So
I think this is incredible how we've been fed by the food industry what to eat. And I think it's been quite corrupted. And if that's the cereal industry, I can only imagine the margarine industry are very, very similar. And, all the processed foods.
Yeah.
I found the cereal industry.
I think quite corrupted is a very gentle way of saying it. I think it's absolutely, can I say it's 100% responsible for that?
Silenced my husband. They silenced a doctor and fear into other doctors of talking about this. And I think since Gary has had his name, since he's been cleared and exonerated, in fact, they not even cleared, because he never did anything wrong. So all the trumped up charges were all dropped.
Yeah.
And since that's happened, we've had a lot of people contact, say, I'm so excited now I can start to talk to people about this. Or I thought what you were talking about was dangerous, because that's what we're all led to believe. It went out in, APRA put it out as a media release. So people feared also coming under the clutches of APRA and regulation.
It's a very real fear. You've lost 4.5 years of your life trying to dig your way out of this little one.
And the reason I didn't get into trouble was because I'm not registered.
Yeah.
And so again, naturopaths and people who aren't under those regulatory bodies have an opportunity to do so much more healing. And you think, this is crazy when the people who are meant to be health professionals are being regulated. And I would say the dietary guidelines have been shaped by vested interests and ideology, and that they're fiercely protected by associations that have got ties to food and pharmaceutical industry. And that includes not just the Dietitians Association of Australia, but Diabetes Australia and the Heart Foundation. They are so tied to food and pharmaceutical industry. I mean, the Heart Foundation have got a big handshake with Sanitarium with the cholesterol lowering Weet-Bix. Zoe Harcum debunks it and says it's ridiculous what they're talking about. So again, we need to cut all these ties and actually understand what health really means for everybody, for mums, for kids. And I think empowering people by understanding that we've been listening to a group that have vested interests, not in our health, but in our sickness, or in their profits and their shareholders, but to use an association that we rely on for health information, that's when it's gone too far.
Yeah. Well, we've stuck to these guidelines and we've grown up with them and we've fed our kids like this, and now we've got 280 people diagnosed with type 2 diabetes every day in Australia, and I think it's 8 in 10 children leaving school in the year 2020 are predicted to be obese or overweight. We've got to change it, and it's up to, I think it's up to us mums or parents, and how we're, choosing to feed our kids at home is just going to turn around the health of this next generation. And
type 2 diabetes used to be an old person's disease.
Not anymore.
So the government didn't worry about it because they were retired, or, it was later. It's happening in our schools now, and it's completely reversible.
Yeah.
And it's a really important message for people to understand, which is why Gary was being silenced, because not only the food industry didn't want people to know you could go low carb, but the pharmaceutical industry don't want people to know that you can reverse it simply by changing your diet. And the earlier, the better. I think Tim Noakes said it took him 5 years to reverse diabetes. He was so far gone, and he blames a lot of that on his carb loading for sport. He said his generation was the guinea pig of high carb. They didn't high carb before that. So lowering your carbohydrates and processed foods is going to give our kids so much better start and opportunity to be healthy throughout their life then.
And I just think it's also worth stressing that this style of eating is about preventative healthcare as much as it is about turning around current chronic health conditions. It's the same foundation food rules for all of us.
It certainly is. And it's sustainable. It's also affordable. Because we've worked with a lot of people. Gary ran Fairsy's Fat Busters with a group of local people here. We did it, I think, 3 or 4 years. And it was great. And there were people from all socioeconomic areas, and they were amazed that they could afford to do low-carb, healthy fat. It's not unachievable. And I think, you can get cheap fatty mints. It's cheaper than the lean meats. So you can really do it. And
I liken it to, I live in Torquay in Victoria, and at the moment we've just got this crazy housing booms and houses going up everywhere. And I liken this idea to, when you build a house, you don't say, how can I get the cheapest of everything and just make it stand up so that it functions. You want to invest as much money as you can into having a really strong, beautiful home. And why don't we apply that same logic to our bodies? It's, it's not necessarily about getting the cheapest, it's about the best possible fuel we can.
And if you invest in your health now, hopefully you won't become a medical tourist when you're retiring. Because that's what Gary says, medical tourists, people going from one doctor's appointment to the next doctor's appointment, to the hospital, to have this and that. And the cost in medication, Gary was on 13 or 15 medications a day, and he's down to 1.5. The cost savings in so many ways, and that's just investing in your health. But our daughter worked out that it was pretty much exactly the same cost to do low carb as to do the healthy eating guide.
I am so grateful to you for this conversation, and I really wish we had another hour or 2 or 3.
Well, I really appreciate you asking me, Edwina. Thank you so much. And
I know you have a little gift for our audience. Have you got a minute just to tell them what that is?
Yes, it's a link to all of the work that I've done for the last 1.5 years. I'm not charged for anything, so I don't have it